Let me just begin by welcoming everybody here tonight. This is very, very exciting. And of course, at sundown, we will count the 33rd day of the Omer, which is Lag BaOmer in our Jewish tradition, which is why we put this event tonight, because it is celebratory. And Lag BaOmer marks the end of the plague that killed 24,000 students. And we can imagine wanting a celebration on a day when a plague that killed so many would end, as we are living in the middle of so many plagues. One of them is a virus, and the other are the plagues of hatred and violence that we experience in our world in so many different forms. So tonight we're celebrating this book, but it's really a jumping off point. It's a springboard to really engage in the conversation of what does it mean to even use the word ally, or as Rabbi Moskowitz has coined, Chaver, the word Chaver up, to become connected to become connected to in such a deep way that we can only react and inform the world in which we live with that sense of connected to somebody else. Now, I want to say a few words about this before we invite our participants to read to introduce themselves and then read a little bit from their pieces. Is that one of the things that we've learned, any one of us, and I think it includes all of us on this Zoom conversation, is that this is very hard work. It's work in which it's necessary to make mistakes. And when you make those mistakes, you will get responses which might be very uncomfortable. It requires us to leave our comfort zones and to be in places that we're not necessarily the most comfortable. It requires us to think about the world through the lens of people whose life experiences are very different from our own. And it also requires us to think both how to, and we'll talk about what this word actually means, but how to actually act in a world in which we are behaving and acting and doing to function in a way of being an ally or an upstander or a chaver, but also it requires us to think in which places and in what ways have we personally benefited from someone else who has acted in such a way. And the truth is, every human being occupies all those spaces at once. There are always places in which we know what it's like when somebody, and I want all of us to think about this, where has there been a moment where somebody has said something, stood up for us, said something that made us feel like our most vulnerable piece, somebody else is seeing, protecting, helping, witnessing. And that is really important to inform how we then can also act in the world, both, and this is true for every single one of us as human beings. We benefit from those who act and use the verb form of ally, and we also need to call on ourselves to do the same. So throughout tonight's program, and I hope inspired by the many brilliant contributions to this book, this won't just be an academic exercise. This isn't just to study something only for the sake of learning something new intellectually. It's about how it impacts on our heart, our souls, and ultimately, I believe, how it helps us all become closer to the one who has made each of us. And that is a part of the relationship piece. So I'd like to start by opening it up to our three participants. I'd like to start with you, Rabbi Mike Moskowitz. First, tell us your pronouns and then tell us why this project is so important to you.
Thank you so very much, Rabbi Kleinbaum, for making this, this project possible, making this position possible. I feel so honored that our names are both together on the cover of this book. In our conversation about how to be more impactful in the world of allyship, it became really clear that we've inherited a broken world. It's on us to fix it. And having conversations within the LGBT community about how to make this world better are important, but the problems don't exist because of the LGBT world. They exist because of the outside world. And so I really felt that we needed to kind of pivot and shift from trying to create safe spaces, and even from dismantling, unsafe spaces, to creating, just a universe where there are no such thing as unsafe space. And so that was really, for me, a process of thinking about where are the conversations happening more broadly that have impact to other communities and to other people, to be able to get a message of allyship as spiritual practice. And so it became clear to kind of reach out to other spiritual leaders and rabbis and clergy within different kind of streams of our faith tradition, to ask them to kind of explore through their own traditions better language and expressions and modalities of both being on the receiving end and also modeling what it looks like for their congregations and their communities for allyship, as a way of simply spreading the message that CVST does so well and really allowing it to echo into distant places.
Thank you so much. And I do want to point out what's kind of obvious by looking at the four of us who are presenting tonight, that the diversity of this book is much broader than is unfortunately happening in many places in the Jewish world. In terms of the Jewish backgrounds of the four of us, Rabbi Moskowitz has ordinations from Haredi institutions, ultra-Orthodox yeshivish institutions. Kohenet Keshira haLev Fife is a Kohenet, a priestess, and maybe we'll get to hear a little bit more about that. And Rabbi Rick Jacobs is the leader of the Reform Movement and has ordination from the Reform Movement. One of the ways, and I was ordained by the Reconstructionist movement, and I'm a member both of the Reform and the Reconstructionist rabbinical associations. But I think one of the ways that the world is really broken, which we don't always focus on when we focus a lot on identity things, is the way the Jewish world is deeply broken in the inability to bring people together, to respect different spiritual leaders and the teaching both of heart and of mind that each has to offer. So thank you so much. And now I'd love to invite Kohenet Keshira haLev Fife. Tell us your pronouns and tell us why this project was important to you to participate.
Thank you for having me. I am Kohenet Keshira haLev Fife. My pronouns are the she and they series pronouns, and I am on Osage and Haudenosaunee land, also called Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I was delighted and honored to be asked to be part of this project. Firstly, I'm delighted anytime Rabbi Mike asks me to be involved in anything, that's for starters. And secondly, when I heard what the project was about, I'm a lover of language. I believe that stories are enlivened, things come alive in language. And when I hear the word ally, I'm reminded that its root comes from the Latin. It means to be bound, to be obligated to one another. And when I think about the ally relationship, that's what it is. It's a relationship. And so to me, allying, if that's a word, is to be actively in relationship with one another. What better way to show up than to give of myself and ask myself to reflect on where have I been an ally, where have I not been an ally, where have I benefited from allyship, and to explore that across the Jewish spectrum. So I'm thrilled to be here.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much for being here. And Rick Jacobs, would you introduce yourself and tell us your pronouns and tell us why it was important for you to be a part of this project?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Rabbi Rick Jacobs, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm just thrilled and honored to be part of this collection and this evening. And frankly, anything Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum is involved in, I'm already supportive of. And then I asked, what is it that we're doing, Sharon? And what a privilege to get to meet Rabbi Mike Moskowitz. What a resource, what a teacher, what a Chaver. And I have to be honest, and Kohenet, I'm honored and delighted to meet you and look forward to learning your Torah as well tonight. I have to say that when the invitation came, it came at a moment when we were really struggling and working on how we really teach and model for the Reform movement, which is large and diverse. And we try to take our justice work very seriously, internally and externally. Everywhere we are, we take those values. And, the idea of how we need allyship and frankly, how it is a struggle. And it doesn't matter who you are if you take it seriously. So I had a chance to really share with my colleagues at the URJ who work every day in this space And they were really loving in calling me in, you know, that beautiful way in which we don't call people out, but call them in, and to really dig into what would be the way to understand and model and reach for that, that beautiful experience that you've described as something we receive, but also something we convey. And I love that we take ally from being something that brings war people together, right? You know, who are the allies? Well, the people are fighting together. Well, you know, fighting for good, I'd rather use a different verb than fight. So let's reclaim that word. It has so much deep resonance within the Jewish tradition, which I know we'll hear, and it's on every page of the book. So really excited to see what we can not just experience tonight, but what we can shape in terms of the wider Jewish community.
Yeah. And I think something you've said is so important, which is how painful it can be. And the problem with pain is that we sometimes then shy away from it, but we have to kind of lean into it and breathe through it and say, okay, that was hard. I made a mistake. I got some pushback in this way or that way, but okay, let me see how many mistakes I can make today and understand the spirituality of imperfection. The Holy One calls on us to keep trying, and that's our goal. So Kohenet Keshira haLev Fife, would you bless us with reading a piece of your essay? And their essay is on page 81 of the book, and we're going to hear a little piece of each of the essays. And this essay is on page 81 if you have your book, and we'll explore a little bit of the essays.
Sure. On the evening of October 27th, 2018, I stood at the corner of Forbes and Murray Avenues in the heart of Pittsburgh's Squirrel Hill neighborhood. Mere hours after the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue building, thousands of us swayed as one community, as local teens led us in Havdalah. This weekly Saturday ritual, which marks the transition out of Shabbat, the Jewish sacred day of rest, and into the week ahead, took on a new meaning as that fateful day drew to a close. Night had fallen, and Shabbat was over. But I was drained and exhausted. Even this potent ritual couldn't create a separation from that morning. My system was still in shock and distress. There was a palpable sense of collective confusion about what's next. As the last notes of Havdalah hung in the air, my beloved and I found ourselves ensconced, scooped up under the arms of a Black man. One arm around each of us, he seemed to be cradling us both as he tenderly assured us, "You are not alone. We're here with you. We've got you." As the crowd began to swirl around us, time stopped as we stood shoulder to shoulder, still and silent. And then time started moving again. Our eyes met briefly, and he was gone. We had never seen him before, and we have not seen him since. But his presence, the way he showed up so solidly, left a question mark on my heart. How can I be a better ally? How can I show up better in solidarity with other communities in pain? How can I do a better job of loving even those who I've never met, those I might never see again? Memories of that evening often conjure the Talmud teaching, Kol Yisrael Aravim Ze Lezeh. One common understanding of this text is that all Jewish people are responsible for one another. However, my experience that evening invited me to receive this wisdom in a more expansive way. If the name Yisrael is given to the one who wrestled with God, this can be read as follows. Each one who wrestles with what has been, what is, what will be, bears responsibility for all others who also wrestle.
So beautiful and so profound that you chose a moment in which the act of chavership, of allyship, is a brief one. It doesn't, there's a moment where somebody literally showed up to an event and was able to be there. And it's not the same as somebody who engages in a long-term relationship. And that's a very powerful truth, that sometimes a very simple act that's done with that kind of authentic love and support has the kind of impact that you're describing. Thank you so much for that. And we'll get engaged in a conversation after we've heard the others. Rabbi Rick Jacobs, would you please read from yours, which is on page 8 of our book?
Thank you. The mitzvah of allyship. Being Jewish is at the core of who I am. And for most of my life, I have moved safely through Jewish spaces without feeling the need for an ally. I am a straight, cisgender, white, Ashkenazi Jewish man living without a disability, who is a rabbi, a baby boomer, and the child of 2 Jewish parents. While I've both witnessed and personally experienced anti-Semitism, my dominant identities have granted me access to most spaces, and I have found nearly every Jewish door open to me along my life's journey. But in recent years, I've spoken with individuals from many marginalized backgrounds whose experience in Jewish spaces have been more difficult than my own. They made it abundantly clear that more often than not, people fail to acknowledge, disrupt, and prevent these harmful and othering experiences. I had to ask myself, where was I in those moments? How do I say Hineni, here I am, to those who count on me to build more inclusive and equitable Jewish communities? How can I be the ally that I personally have not needed to be? Yolanda Savage Narva, the Union for Reform Judaism's Director of Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and one of my teachers, teaches that ally is a verb, not a noun. To ally is not simply to offer support and encouragement to those on the margins. It requires the courage to disrupt a problematic moment, to acknowledge who's missing from a conversation, planning committee, or leadership team. Allyship is far from simple. It takes a lot of practice and the bravery to allow oneself to make mistakes and to be accountable for them. To ally means to embody the spirit of Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, who witnessed shepherds driving off the 7 daughters of the Midianite priest who were trying to water their father's flock. Instead of shying away because it was someone else's problem, or because these women belonged to a different faith community, Moses rose to their defense. In that moment, he didn't see the distinction between Jew and Midianite. He saw men harassing women, and he stepped in. He allied because it was the right thing to do. If Moses experienced a similar encounter with these women today, I imagine he should ask them, how do you need me to act? Do I step forward on your behalf? Do I stand nearby while you assert your right to draw from the well? As Jewish leaders, if we seek to emulate our greatest teacher, we should not assume that allying always means leading up front. Those of us with many privileges and opportunities need to lead in the way we're needed in each moment. And at times, that means stepping back and supporting those who need it. And yet, it is often hard to know the most respectful way to ally in such situations.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And I think, Rick, one of the things that's so moving to me about your piece and about who you are as a human being, and Rick and I have known each other for a long time, since he was the rabbi of a small congregation in Brooklyn Heights, Brooklyn, long before he became the head of the Reform Movement. And he's always been this person who's always been asking these questions. And the questions are both personal. And then when you're running an institution, then there's a whole other set of issues about how to build into the DNA of an institution, not just your personal choices. And that raises a whole other set of issues, Rick, which I think you've embodied really struggle with, and figuring it out and trying and moving on and trying other things and learning. And I think that's an important piece of this book, that many of the essays talk about the personal and many talk about the institutional and the ways that we all function inside of institutions, and we all can have impacts inside of institutions. And then some are some of the authors have by title and by role power, and that it's a very interesting piece of this discussion. It's not only our personal feelings, of course, it's how we change the actual institutions in our world and how we do it from whichever position, wherever we are inside of our institutions. And that's a really key piece and a complicated piece. So Mike Moskowitz, I'd like to invite you to read from, and as I said from the very beginning, this project was his idea, and he has been working on this very idea of allyship as a spiritual practice, which also embeds in the concept that it is, a work in progress. It's not like you arrive and you're done. It's not. It's something where you're constantly developing and building those muscles. So please, would you read for us?
Thank you. The Talmud teaches that the Torah is only acquired b'chabura, within a collective, and declares a sword upon the enemies of Torah scholars, a euphemism for the Torah scholars themselves who sit alone and study Torah. Being in a relationship with the community is a condition for learning Torah today, just as it was a prerequisite for the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Like one person with one heart. A common goal and focus can organize people, but they remain distinct and disjointed. Coming together for a purpose is not the same as coming together as a person. Torah, when studied properly together, protects us and preempts the need for systemic change because it gives everyone an immediate awareness of the needs and experiences of each other. It even defends against outside forces that come to challenge our peaceful coexistence. When Sancheriv came to destroy Jerusalem, King Hezekiah inserted a sword at the entrance of the study hall and said, "Anyone who does not engage in studying Torah shall be stabbed with this sword." The word for sword, cherev, and ally, chaver, are the same three letters, just in a different order. Sancherev is understood as an anagram for the prince of the sword, cherev nasi. This is an allusion to the blessing that Esav received, "By your sword shall you live," and a promise of Jacob's voice being found in the study halls. The Baal HaTurim describes the two kruvim on the ark, the angels, like two study partners engaging in the back and forth of Torah learning. The Sforno adds, their wings spread in an upward direction, as if reflecting that they had received spiritual inspiration from the contents of the ark, enabling them to fly. Elevation over subjugation is the path necessary to gain entrance to sacred spaces. After we were banished from the Garden of Eden, God placed the kruvim and revolving sword to guard the way to the tree of life, and continues to deny entry to those who try and limit the access of others. When we learn about and with those of a different lived experience, we expand our understanding of the Torah and fulfill its purpose in elevating humanity. We must come together for God, Torah, and each other.
Thank you so much. And I think for those of you who have not had a chance to actually read the book yet, you get just a little Vorspeise there, a little taste of the depth and the diversity of the perspectives that are offered in the book. So I have a question for each of you, or for any of you who want to take on this question, which is, what makes it difficult to accept allyship? How has it been hard in your lives? Can you think of a moment where it's been complicated to be in the position of accepting allyship? Does anybody want to take that or think about that issue? The reason I'm asking is because it gets to the point of how we actually do it in ways that are useful.
I can try to ally to take up some of the awkward space of silence.
It's not awkward to me. Silence is a friend.
Silence is a friend. I think at its core, part of being created in the image of God is that God is a giver. God's a noisein. And so we are naturally at our core givers. And there's a way in which when we recognize that we are not self-sufficient, that we require others, that it makes us uncomfortable because we're vulnerable, because we recognize that, that we have needs. And our tradition teaches that part of God's perfection is having the need to give, and we, as part of our being human, have the need to receive. And you know, on a more personal level, when someone in my family came out as trans, and I couldn't grasp any sort of traction in trying to understand, how do you understand gender, that you're a boy and not a girl, from your body, if your body is different than mine? In that moment, I said to him, even though I'm a teacher by profession, I'm really going to need you to explain this to me. I need you to be my Rebbe. I need you to be my teacher. And that for me was the source of the beginning of the blessing of the recognition that I know that I don't know. And then it's possible to receive.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point that is said in different ways throughout the book. And Darby Lee, who is an intern at CBST and is now a rabbi in Concord, Massachusetts, and is profoundly deaf since birth, talks about one of the issues is that people make assumptions that are just, where do you even begin if the very well-intentioned hearing world makes assumptions that are simply not accurate, and the hearing world doesn't stop and ask questions first, or try to say, I don't know what your experience is, can you teach me, is the first step. So we have a question from our audience. Rabbi Jacobs raises a vital point that sometimes allyship means standing back. Can our participants give an example of when they practice that sort of allyship?
So I'm going to say last night, we had the launch of our racial justice campaign of the Reform Movement with lots of allies. It was beautiful across the Jewish spectrum and beyond. And as we were planning, you know, the group said, well, of course, Rick, Jonah, Rabbi Jonah Pesner, Rick Jacobs, me, you know, and we both said, no, that is not a racial justice campaign. People who look like me are not going to stand at the microphone and frame the entire work in the evening. And, you know, to have been a part of this event last night for an hour were the extraordinary voices and perspectives of a range of leaders from our community who are often not at the microphone in front of thousands of people. And it wasn't some act of, you know, like chesed. It was clearly the right thing. I mean, if we're going to stand as a community, particularly for racial justice in this moment, are we not going to understand that part of that is the way our Jewish community is organized and who has the privilege of leading in almost, you know, every institution? So again, and it wasn't instinctive, and people thought, oh, well, of course, you know, you're the president, you have to, and the answer is no, that's not actually a requirement. And so again, I'm not doing that. If you ask me all the times where I was at the microphone and I shouldn't have been there, I could keep you here all night. But that was one, partly because the whole community that was planning it said, this is clearly how we have to be.
Thank you. That's a great example. Keshira, tell us about being a Kohenet. What does that mean? And that's certainly not a standard Jew in the contemporary Jewish world. You identify as a queer Jew of color, so you have many different places in which you stand. But tell us a little bit about being a Kohenet and what that means, and how tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I'll say just a word about Kohenet, and then I'll try to frame it in terms of allyship if I can. The Kohenet Hebrew Priestess
Institute. Take your time.
Institute,
We're all yours.
We are a Jewish clergy training program that is based in earth-based embodied Judaism. And at our core, we are trying to reclaim voices which, if we're polite, we might say those voices have been forgotten. And if we are realistic, we can say that they've been erased or they've been suppressed. My first degree is in social history. So I always ask the question, when this thing was written, who was at the table having the discussion, and who was serving tea? What did they hear when they walked in and out of the room? And what did they do with that information? What were the people who were excluded doing? How were they practicing Judaism? So Kohenet, even though it's not part of our official mandate, we are an organization built around anti-oppression, around reclaiming leadership. However, here's the rub. It's not, as I was taught as a young person about emulating white male leaders. If you can believe it, looking at me now, I went to Carnegie Mellon wearing a suit and a necktie because I thought that if I looked like the people who were being respected, I too might be respected. And it took my coming to Kohenet to learn that I can be a leader, powerful in my grace, at the back of the room, with the quietness of my prayer or companionship. And part of that is because of allyship. We frame it in terms of tzimtzum, that in the creation, new things could only come to be because God contracted, Goddess contracted, the way a womb contracts in order for something new to come into the world. And my beloved likes to say he practices the art of tzimtzum, that when it's time to bring out the Kiddush cup, he's in the room, but he's not the one that puts his arm out to reach for it. He might even suggest that myself or somebody else in the room be the one to lift the Kiddush cup. And we talk a lot about what does our constellation look like? Even in our silence, the way that we conduct ourselves within a group of people can be a show of allyship, treating each other with kavod, what have you. So to bring it back, within Kohenet, yes, sometimes we are radical, sometimes we are at the fringe, and sometimes we are doing a style of remembering that conjures the kind of Judaism that some in the mainstream might like to forget. But in a roundabout way, we are doing this for the sake of allyship, to make a place for those who have been marginalized, who have been excluded, to find their way home, to know that they're not alone. We can counter isolation by being ourselves with each other.
So as I said, I don't know that there's been a Jewish panel with 4 more different Jewish leaders in the world. And it's another way that I'm so proud of what we're doing tonight. There are ways that things happen that aren't as visible. I remember as anti-Semitism has been rising in New York City, those of us who look like me, honestly, on the street, I've gotten harassed, especially when we were down on Bethune Street, with anti-lesbian epithets thrown at me from cars, which was normal and I was used to. But I've never on the street of New York, for instance, been attacked as a Jew because, I kind of blend into what New York looked like. Look, what New Yorkers look like. And I walk around the streets of New York looking like that. So Mike Moskowitz doesn't have that advantage. It's an advantage and a disadvantage, right? Everybody looks at him and says, that's what a Jew looks like, which some of us resent because we don't want to say a rabbi can only look like Mike Moskowitz. On the other hand, I heard from him in very quiet ways, walking from the subway to CBST, the kind of experience of hatred that he withstood because indeed he does look like what the world imagines a Jew looks like, and he happens to be a Jew. And he experienced a level of harassment on the street. And the reason I say this is because it's complicated, right? He's cisgendered, straight man, white man. So in many ways, he occupies a world of protected privilege in some ways. But honestly, walking through the streets of New York at a moment of rising anti-Semitism, he's much more vulnerable than I am, who, as a lesbian, I feel safer on the streets of New York right now than Mike Moskowitz does. That's how complicated these things can be in what it means to be both in positions of power and strength. And exactly what Keshira was saying, when Rabbi Mike Moskowitz speaks or teaches, he might be given a certain level of respect because he does look like that. And at the same time, experience a level of anti-Semitism for the same reason. And I think that's important to balance out. We're all human beings trying to make our way. And the very same things that can give us protection in some places are the things that can make us extremely vulnerable in others. And I say this only to say, don't assume because you're looking at somebody that you know what their worlds and where their vulnerabilities exist. A friend of mine who's a leader in the disability rights movement, very, very active in the disability rights movement, and in fact wrote the Americans with Disabilities Act legislation, has a disability that's not visible to the world. And she often says, when we talk about these issues, we can never only talk about what's visible and what the other person will see, but we have to remember there's a whole level of universe that exists that's not necessarily on the surface for somebody else to be able to see. And that's pretty complicated. All right, we have another question from Sherry Feynman. Does being an ally mean a connection to one particular movement, cause, or source of injustice? I'll leave that for, let's see, don't be shy. I'm empowering everybody to step forward, whoever wants to respond to that.
I hope it doesn't mean that. I mean, I hope it means what the moment needs. You know, it's easy to, you know, kind of be comfortable and make others comfortable in the circle in which you most often reside or work. You know, I found myself in Haredi circles where I am like the one non-Haredi person in the room. And, you know, I'm in here with a lot of Jewish people, maybe a ton of rabbis. Boy, am I in need of a Chaver in that moment, because, you know, especially if I'm identified as the head of the Reform movement, it is literally like I am Haman. And yet when that Haredi person is in my normal, you know, circle in the Jewish community, I better be a very immediate ally, so that, you know, my Chaver Mike Moskowitz came and taught, there would be some people who immediately would put him in a box, not a Zoom box, but a box. So I think part of this is to be in the moment of what is needed. You may need to be an ally in ways that you have never been an ally before, but if you're awake and aware and you see and you feel, I think that's where we most need it. And I hope it makes us more elastic as human beings to be who we need to be.
I'd love to add to that, that the allyship lives in the relationship between us. And it's maybe unpopular in our culture, where people are choosing to be more invested in what works for them than in what works for the collective in a lot of cases, to remember that we are bound to one another. And when we are actually bound to one another, it doesn't require any thought. There's no formulation or calculation of should I speak up or what should I do in this situation. If your partner or your child or your parent, someone dear to you, is in peril, there's no consideration of whether it's a moment to be an ally or not. We act from a place of heart connectedness that is born of knowing that we belong to one another.
And I'm going to ask another question that's being asked by a number of the Chaver Up selections bring up humility. This is from Gail Meister. Brings up humility and recognizing one's privilege. Can the panelists speak about this? Anybody want to take that on? Keshira, can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Recognizing privilege is a phrase du jour. I think it can be a hobby in a lot of circles.
Well said. Yep.
I think
and annoying. It could get a little annoying, right?
Fair enough. I think in most cases, well, certainly everyone here, by virtue of having internet and free time to be at this panel, has a level of privilege. And I think that the sweetness or the potency in this is to recognize that we're coming from a place of privilege and that the privilege is currency. We can do something with it. And what we can do with it, contrary to Jewish practice, is not be guilty about it. That's the typical thing that happens, as people say, oh, I have so much privilege. Like, oh, woe is me. Now I feel bad for myself because I have so much privilege. What are you going to do with the privilege? What could you say? What could you enact? Who could you have a private conversation or a loud conversation with? Where could you spend some of that privilege, whether that's time privilege or money privilege or both, in order to create more equity? The privilege is nothing to be ashamed of. It's like the inheritance of privilege is something that we have a lot of power as a result of, and we can do amazing things, and we can do even more amazing things if we use our privilege collectively.
I want to highlight, thank you, that was beautiful. And it reminded me of the last essay in the book, which is by another Rabbi Dan Judson, who served CBST as the first straight male rabbi from the Reform movement, rabbinical students. He was an HUC student. And very interestingly, in the early years, we had a lot of straight women who were comfortable coming to CBST to be rabbinical interns, but not men. Straight men were much more uncomfortable about masculinity and what it would mean to be assumed or questioned about whether they were gay or not. And in general, and of course, this is a gross generalization, in those days, and now we're talking about the 90s, there were many more straight women or straight identified women who were willing to say, I know what it is to have a strong relationship with another woman. It might not be a sexual one, but I certainly understand women's connection. And many straight men were very uncomfortable with being close to gayness. But Dan was the first one who did that. And he was a fantastic intern. I can't even remember what year it was, somewhere in the mid 90s. And he tells this amazing story that when he was applying for positions upon graduation, he was offered a position in a synagogue in Massachusetts, which he wasn't sure whether he should take it or not. He took the position, he interviewed, and he got some serious pushback. This is the last essay in the book. And he was asked, and somebody said to him, how dare you take that position? Don't you know that a lesbian was denied the position because of the homophobia of the synagogue? And Dan tells the story. I don't remember this, but he tells the story that he called me to ask what he should do or how it should go. And then it became clear. He couldn't pretend that he was a lesbian or a gay man or a queer person. He's not. And he needed to use that privilege to go into that synagogue and change it. It's not that that synagogue should be boycotted. And this is where I disagree with some of the politics around today. But precisely because he had access, he needed to use that access and change the synagogue. And by the way, the synagogue now has a gay rabbi. And by the way, Dan Judson became the leading Reform rabbi in Massachusetts. And guess which state had the first marriage for same-sex couples made legal? Massachusetts. And I believe Dan Judson, he was not at the lead as a straight man, but he was in the lead of the religious community making that happen. So I think that's a great example of, had he just said, I'm not going there because they discriminate, but he did exactly what Keshira is saying. He had to say, how can I use my privilege? And yes, there are times to boycott. There are times to not engage. There are times to punish. But at that moment in the 90s, the Jewish community needed education. And that's difficult to do, but it needs education. And that, I think, is a very difficult line to know. When do you boycott somebody because they are not, that they're not evolved and they're not able to see what you know to be the truth? And when do you dive right in, engage, especially if you have some privilege? It's very hard. If you don't have privilege, it takes a lot. It's pretty tough. When I first became rabbi at CBST, I spent those first 10 years on a dog and pony show circuit going, because there were not many openly LGBT rabbis. And I would go Shabbat after Shabbat after Shabbat, not literally after it, but I would go on these speaking to all Reform and Reconstructionist synagogues. Conservative synagogues, there are only a few who would even have me speak. And in Reform and Reconstructionist synagogues, the insanity that I would hear from these liberal Jews about homosexuality and about gay people and quoting me the Bible. I once said to a guy who on a Shabbat afternoon said, what about Leviticus? I said, we are in a Reform synagogue in Westchester, New York. You're going to probably leave here and eat shrimp for lunch, and you're quoting Leviticus at me. All of a sudden, you're a Bible-thumping fundamentalist about me, but you're going to go out and eat something that's totally treif by the, that took. But I have heard from the rabbi since, by the way, the impact of just meeting a person who said, let's listen to what that sounds like, to what it sounds to a human being, not just a theoretical thing. But it takes a toll. It's not easy. And thank God there were many other people who stepped up. Keshira, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I want to chime in on there's a big spectrum between boycotting and looking the other way. I think that's what I want to say. And I'm a fan of building new paradigms. I spent 13 years living in Australia. I was once invited to come and co-lead a Kabbalat Shabbat. And when
That why you use the U in color?
It is. I'm sorry. Old habits die hard. I was asked to come and co-lead a Kabbalat Shabbat. And then when it came down to it and we were planning, I was informed that if I could co-lead from the back of the room, not sing, be quiet. That was how this was set up. So my choices were to either take my toys and go home, or to look the other way and do it anyway. And what I decided to do was to honor this request, because I want to show kavod to other people and to their styles of practice. And then to make the request that after the Kabbalat Shabbat, could we have another space so that we can daven in a way that feels true to me and to anybody else who wants to be led in prayer by someone like me, and that those things can happen concurrently. So I think there are ways to navigate. We can go around, we can create new, we can create alongside in ways that are mutually respectful, assuming that no one is causing harm. There is a fine line between putting a boundary around what we call sacred and being exclusive. And we can work together to hold those things in balance, I believe.
That's just so beautiful, Keshira. That's so beautiful. And I think the other thing to remember is that people have different appetites for different kind of work. And we need to honor that. It's as much about our personalities and what God has given us. I have the ability, and I know I can feel the blood pressure rising. I can sit down with the worst homophobe in the world. Up until a certain point, I can feel where it's triggering, and then I got to walk away. But I also know I can engage in a conversation to a certain point. And then I'm grateful when there's somebody else who can step in. And you need to know that about yourself. For some people, that would be crushing. And so you can't put yourself in a position also where you know would be really creating a position of harm. And that's a part of knowing where we are, and different ones of us can engage in that. I have to say, watching Rabbi Mike Moskowitz, who lives in a world in which it's not his own. I mean, I'm so aware of how much loss he experiences every day, and yet is able to find a way to be present. And I think that's the way that we have to kind of always be open to the human beings in the world are really experiencing things different than ourselves. And how do we get to be in enough relationship that we can say, tell me what your world feels like. What does it feel like to be you? How are you swimming through this particular moment or that particular moment? And it's almost as exciting. I have a lot of Hebrew students in my Psalms class watching as people are learning to decode the alphabet. And the first feeling when you could read Shabbat Shalom in the Hebrew letters, people have described in the class how exciting it is. My experience around this, where I've learned and been exposed to in a deep relational way what somebody else's life is like, it's like that excitement of decoding the alphabet, of realizing, wow, not only do I feel not less by it, I feel so excited to have a taste of what exists in the world that I did not know.
Can I just add one proof text?
Yeah.
Because this is my happy space. The Gemara says that the order of Havdalah, the ceremony of separation that normally we do Saturday night, says that the order of Havdalah was established in Yavne. So Yavne, of course, was a city of scholars. Yavne is also an acronym for the different parts of Havdalah. There's the Yayin, the Besamim, the Ner, and Havdalah. The order of Havdalah, those different parts of the candle, the spices, etc. And the commentators point out that there's an order of separation. You don't get to separate yourself from somebody because they're different from the very beginning. There's a process of like boxes you have to check in terms of engagement. I try to engage in kind of a cerebral way. Did I try to engage with them like in an emotional way? Did I try to engage with them in a social and cultural way? The person tries to engage and says, was willst du from there? There's nothing else I can do. So we go, okay, Shane, so I can't, but we walk away when we can't walk any closer.
Beautiful.
Can I add something?
Yeah, go right ahead.
So we were having this machloket yesterday with a group of our chaverim on our staff. And the question was, when do you actually, in a public setting, when someone expresses a microaggression, and we sometimes as Jews and as rabbis and as leaders, we have very clear teachings about not humiliating people in public. So how do you disrupt that moment? So at the URJ, in all leadership settings, we all share our pronouns. Not everybody does it because they feel it, understand it, and think it's important, but they know that's part of what we do, and hopefully they'll come to appreciate it. So the question is, when that microaggression is expressed, how do you respond? So we had a gathering, and someone was making literal joke out of pronouns, about sharing pronouns. So the feeling was, okay, I could call them out right here in front of 200 people. We know how to do that as people. We know how to do that as leaders. But is that the right thing? Should I wait till after and then call them in? And then the question was, but what are you going to do for those 199 people who will have witnessed that humiliation of all the non-binary and it's not only about that person. They've done something bapombi in the public space. Is there a way to lovingly and emphatically address that moment that doesn't humiliate, but does elevate? And we were actually brainstorming with all our experiences. When have we been able to do that public moment and not to let it stand and not to just say, I'm going to find a quiet moment and I'm going to just raise that issue? Because that is, I think, for many of us or most of us, the way we normally would respond. And that actually, in our day and age, is just not the only thing we should have in our toolbox. And I think that's one really, talk about new muscles, that's a new muscle for leadership.
That's so, it's so important. I want to share a story that actually involves Keshira. I don't know if she remembers this, but we were invited both to speak in Baltimore. Yeah, and you probably even know what I'm talking about in terms of the incident, but I gave a lecture on graceful masculinity. And the host, the person who had invited us, was engaging, like, what does this mean? And we were talking about, taking up space that didn't belong. And in a statement that was very clearly positive in terms of the intention, he said something to the effect of, oh, so I should allow my wife to. And so, do you remember this? So being that we were all in relationship and we were all there with good intentions, I said to him, I love you. That's why I'm here. I mamish love you. And I know that you will appreciate this, but this is a great example of the space between intention and impact. And it became a teachable moment where framing it, having already had a relationship, to say, listen, I love you. And I know that at your core, you want to know how to do this better. And so it's about bringing, and I so appreciate your language, Rabbi Jacobs, of calling in that, like, I know you want to do this better, but when we give up the, use language of giving up space, we're actually claiming ownership to it to begin with. Yeah. I don't know, Keshira, if you want to reflect on what that was like for you in the audience, but.
You're muted, Keshira.
I remember that moment really well, handled with such grace and care. And it does strike me that there's a balance that we can come to between the firmness, because in the firmness and the willingness to name it, everybody who feels the ouch of what has just been spoken feels the allyship in the room. And hopefully, if the person who's being addressed is able to make a little bit of space for it, to take a deep breath and to not feel personally attacked, to hear what is being said to them, it can really be a transformative moment. I suspect that conversation continued on after we were gone from the room. Thanks for bringing it up.
So another question that is a very important layering on top of what I said. Let me see who said this. Oh, Gail Meister, thank you. In some of my anti-racism study, we're warned not to depend on or over ask someone else to teach us or to tell us how it is for them. Indeed. So it's not their responsibility to be the eternal victim. How do we deal with this in the definition of allyship? So I can respond to that, but let me see if there are others anybody else of the four want to respond?
I think this is one of those examples. For example, I was presenting in a community with a really wonderful Jew of color. And there were some really I'm sure the person was working through a lot of issues, but they asked a question that was so offensive to my colleague. And she certainly could answer it brilliantly, but it just one look, it felt clear. I just want to check with a look, that this was for me to respond and not have to subject, again, that day she probably handled it 4 or 5 times.
Right.
So where are those, and people often, asking the person to, to enlighten them, teach me, tell me all about your experience. And you go like, just a moment. That actually is really problematic. We don't do that to, people who look like me. We don't go through that whole litany. So again, when do we need to be that ally in that moment and to respond, and in the response also hold enough of a mirror up to what has just happened that it's a teachable moment.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I want to clarify what I said when I said you can ask somebody. That's somebody you're in deep relationship with. If you're in a connection with somebody with whom you have a deep connection, you can have conversations that can go really deep. That's like true with anything else. But I agree. So that's a very important distinction to make. Yes, anybody who's not in the position should really do a lot of self-education. And those of us who are, whatever the issues are different, have to take leadership to transform the world. But when you're in deep relationship with somebody where it's not exploitative or you're not asking the 101 level, you've already done some work. It's like when you're getting to know anybody else, you want to get more deeply into, and that's when, but so I appreciate very much that distinction. I don't know if others want to respond to that. It comes down a little bit to the question. When I was in the early 80s, I worked at the National Yiddish Book Center, as many of you know. I have some great stories from that, but I want to tell a different story. One of the other people I worked with was Len Glick, who was one of the first, he's an anthropologist, he's a teacher at Hampshire College. And they offered, he told me this story back in the 70s, very early in the world of Holocaust studies, courses on the Holocaust. And the college had a big debate. Whose department should Holocaust studies reside in? Which of course comes down to budget issues. Whose budget should pay for Holocaust studies? Should it come from the Jewish Studies Department or from the German Studies Department? And he loved to tell this story to say that ultimately the Holocaust should be in German departments. It is the Holocaust as a problem should be seen as a German problem, so to speak, and Jews shouldn't pay for it. Now, of course, he's being a little facetious because that's not happening. And in Jewish worlds, we know who's going to study it. But it's an interesting question to ask. Who should own the study of anti-Semitism or of the Holocaust itself, right? Where is racism? And this is my question about the thing that somebody said. It's not about being a victim. Racism is not a problem for people of color. Racism is a problem for non-people of color. The problem is white. It is a white problem. Racism is a white problem. It obviously affects people of color. But when we try and identify who is responsible for it, where do we want to, if you want to understand it, where do you start? So I thought that was a kind of a very early, interesting conversation. And that was at Hampshire College. So Keshira?
I'm going to offer a slightly different perspective on this. I did my undergraduate thesis work on the role of the Holocaust in our collective consciousness. And I began my studies by visiting a number of sites in Poland and in Germany. And the thing that was most prominent to me, even as an undergraduate, was that who is responsible for curating has a great impact on how the narrative is told. So the preservation of Auschwitz-Birkenau is effectively a museum. Whereas if you go to Treblinka or you go to Majdanek, the presentation and the feeling there is very different because of the way that the narrative is couched. There's something parallel here, which is that, yes, it is the work of white folks to do that dismantling of racism, and so too with all other oppressions. However, we have to center the voices of the ones who are most oppressed when we tell the story. And so there's a little bit of a dance. Sometimes people say to me, well, is there a way to ask you your story? And like you said, Rabbi Kleinbaum, if we have a relationship and my phone number is in your phone, just ask. Let's make a time to talk about something and maybe give me a little bit of advanced warning that we're not doing a small talk thing, that you have some deeper questions. If we don't know each other and you want me to come to your organization and talk about the experience of a Jew of color, consider the fact that someone is going to bear the cost of that conversation. And if it's not you, then it's me. And if we prioritize these conversations and we budget for the kind of programming that matters to us, then that time and that emotional labor should be compensated if it's for the purpose of quote unquote enlightening people. And the framing and the relationship that we have has a lot of impact on how those conversations happen. So I guess the same as allyship, one moment we can be in an ally position and one moment we might just be a person on the street. Yeah. So being aware of ourselves, what we're asking, who we're asking, when we're asking, can make all the difference.
Beautiful. And I think something that Rabbi Moskowitz said as well, it's kind of intention and impact. Most people are decent human beings trying to do good in the world and need a little help or maybe a lot of help. And then there's real evil in the world also, where we have to recognize, and we see the rise of visible and powerful white supremacy in this country, which targets people of color and Jews of color. There are different levels and we have to function in the world we're in. I've said so much in the last 4.5 years since Trump was elected. What we can do is work on the holiness of the world in which we each occupy. If we worry about changing and impacting everything, we'll just stay in bed. I mean, there is just no way. But we all have the ability to light in our own universes, whatever they are. For some of us, they're very big institutions. For others, it's the corner of the universe we're in. And we can do a lot to change the energy, the light, the holiness, to increase that holiness. And so that's on all of us. Nobody's exempt from this work. And I think that's part of the power of the collection of these essays, is how many people are signing up for this. And it should be seen as exciting, as an opportunity to expand the light and the holiness and to increase God's presence in the universe and to make this very broken world, just a little bit more redeemed. And we all need to be able to do that together. I'm wondering, before we bring this to conclusion, if you have in your lives a text or a hero or a person or a story that animates your work in this part of the world, either experiencing hope for this possibility of people really, we've watched this change from bystander to upstander, but to do that deeper level, not just when somebody's being beaten on the street, which, please God, we hope people will intervene and be upstanders, et cetera, but also in all the different places that it exists in the world. How do we increase the light? Is there something that inspires you in the work of doing this? So anybody want to take that? I'm just seeing if there are any other questions. I'm asking folks if you have any other questions, because we're going to be.
So can I give an example?
Yep, sure.
We just had a retreat for 4 days with 147 people who are becoming the president of their synagogue. So we have 4 days of learning, and it's not about, how do you run a meeting and Robert's rules, silly things that frankly don't matter in this day. It matters how to be a leader of transformation and change. And so my colleague, Yolanda Savage-Narva, who leads our Ready work, was going to lead a full session with 147 about doing this work in your congregations. We already had a pretty clear sense that it wasn't prioritized by plenty of the good people, the good people who were taking on these roles. And to be honest, I was, lurking in the back. I had my camera off just because the Zoom screen was very full. And I'm thinking to myself, this is going to be, a couple of hours afterwards of just helping people through. It wasn't just that she was incredibly just compelling in how she told the story and how she was shining light on the work. But I would have to say, it's not that everybody was like, all of a sudden, this is now the torch I'm going to carry. every single one of those presidents is going back to their community saying, this is part of what I have to do as the leader of my community. I'm not, many of them said, I don't know how really to do it, but I know I'm supposed to do it, and it's really important. And it will affect not only my congregation and my community, but that is how we're going to move the world. And, you know, I just think also give people, this was one of the things for me was like, give people a little more credit, Rick. You know, I probably thought like, it's too risky. These are just, you know, we got to ease people into it. Sometimes we don't have to ease people into it. We just got to believe that the real thing, the stuff that's real in life, that's really challenging, but really important, people will get that. And they'll find a way to learn what they don't know. Each of us find what we don't know. And that's how the world changes.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. So inspiring.
It's just worth pausing for a moment to recognize that it's a privilege to get to ease in. Lots of folks aren't born with the ease in. They're born right in. Yeah, I appreciate it. I was at that seminar some years ago in a previous incarnation as a synagogue president, and have a lot of kavod for the work that happens there. A lot of seeds were planted for me that really informed my leadership. The person that came to mind immediately when you asked this question is a young, biracial, trans, queer teenager who said to me, I feel most holy when I'm advocating for marginalized people. That for them, the mark of their Judaism is doing this work. And it reminded me, looking at this person who has every reason to be a victim, to feel marginalized and excluded, that's me, with all the privileges that I have, with all the access to things that I have. Some days I'm the victim of oppression, but it's not every day and it's not every moment. And to be honest, more moments than not, I'm on the side where if I do my job well, someone might name me as an ally. Ally isn't a title that we get to choose for ourselves, right? It's what's conferred upon us because of how we conduct ourselves. And so feeling this tension, especially as a Jewish community, when we notice ourselves collapsing into but what about anti-Semitism? We've got to worry about that thing first. It's a real moment to call ourselves in, to be in touch with what's the fear? What's the intergenerational trauma that's keeping me from making myself vulnerable, from putting myself out there as an ally for someone else? So I look to the folks most vulnerable who are doing inspiring work every day. They keep me in line, they keep me grounded, they lift me up. And yeah, grateful to be connected with so many.
Beautiful. We're so grateful to have you as a teacher today and to be part of our community. Rabbi Moskowitz, some final words of...
Sure. Yeah, and thank you. And Keshira, you're such an inspiration. You're such an inspiration. It's hard. I love hearing you speak. It's you know, I think it's just it's a deep inspiration. I think a lot about faith as a call to action. For me personally, like the question has always been like, how much do I actually believe? Like, is my faith in the divine deep enough to take on the precarity, to do what I know is the right thing to do, but like, do I have faith in the consequences that I can be partnered with God and it'll be all right? And the person for me who models that the most is actually Moses. Like, he was raised in this deep place of privilege, right? In Pharaoh's home. The Medrash says that actually one of Moses' names is Chaver. It's one of his names. And there's a really interesting Balaturim in the beginning of Parshas Shmos. Shmos, Exodus, actually is also, like most of the Torah, stands for something deeper, which is Shnayim Mikra V'Echad Targum. That there's a commandment, there's a custom that we're supposed to recite and learn each Torah portion twice every week with one commentary. And I was learning in the mirror, and my Rebbe said, it was Parshas Shmos, and he said, like, that's great that the word Shmos stands for this in Exodus, but like, it's now the beginning of the second of the 5 books. So like, why here is there a reference? And he gave different answers that everybody reads Genesis because it's interesting now you have to, but I was thinking about it this year, that I think the message of why we have to revisit those texts in particular is that when we see something that's uncomfortable, when we start hearing and learning about people being dehumanized and being enslaved, the natural tendency is to look away. And I think what the Torah is saying is, no, you have to look again and look closer and read the commentaries. And Moses was in a position like, he didn't have to, he had a life of privilege. And it's only because he felt that solidarity with humanity that he felt, the Medrash says that he called out to God and he said, when will you just take my life so I don't have to bear witness to this, this dehumanization? And that's how we need to feel, that if we want to have a relationship with God as a parent, then we need to be able to love all of God's children as our siblings. And so the question is, like, how much do we believe that? Like, how much faith do we really have in being willing to do the right thing? And then have faith that, like, God is the ultimate judge. I don't have to worry about how people will judge me.
Beautiful. Here we are on beginning the 33rd day of this journey, this ladder from Pesach to Shavuot, where we leave from physical slavery, from the inability to even control our time or our space in any way. And we're moving up a ladder towards the giving of the Torah, where we can be concerned with the spiritual liberation of our souls and of our world. And I pray that we each continue marching on this ladder up and we achieve our own Sinai's in places of deep revelation. I think next week, Rabbi Moskowitz, you're doing a thing with the Reconstructionist contributors, right? There's going to be
with Rabbi Dr. Mira Wasserman and Rabbi Dr.
Deborah Waxman. So there's an event next week for those who want to hear and talk to other people about it. But my deep, deep gratitude to Rabbi Rick Jacobs and to Kohenet Keshira haLev Fife and to Rabbi Mike Moskowitz and to all of you for joining us. And I hope you read this book, continue studying it and thinking and debating and trying to emerge every day into the people we need to be the allies, to accept the allies, to really chaver up. So thank you very much, everybody, and happy Lag BaOmer.